Good to see all of you tonight. If you got your Bibles with you, we'll start in Romans 11. We'll read that first in just a second. But before we begin, I just want to express my thanks for how many people were able to help out, especially with Jason having to be in, what do we call it, COVID prison now? But it's just so nice to be able that if one person's gone for 2 weeks, that there's so many other men that are capable of helping out and women too, and kind of filling the roles of the important stuff that needs to happen that week. And so I can't thank you enough for many of you that helped fill needs and make sure classes happened and studies happened, and you maybe stepped up and you taught a class, or you stepped up and you preached a sermon because Jason wasn't here. And so I'm just very grateful for that, and I wanted to express that to you all in this fashion. A couple of weeks ago, someone was expressing to me how hard it is to be alone. And there were tears. I mean, it was a hard conversation to have of that they're alone and they hate that they're alone. And especially with the pandemic, being alone even more so when you may have been able to depend on friends. And maybe because of your health or your age, you can't really even spend any time with those friends except, great distances from each other. And that's become very difficult this year. And, I try to be very sympathetic with that. I hate being alone, too. I have nothing good to say about being alone. I even remember when I was first here and maybe Terry had a meeting or something like that, and I didn't have any studies on a particular day, and I wasn't married yet. And, I would come here to the building, and I'd be alone. And I'd be alone all day. And then I'd go home and realize I haven't seen another person all day. And I hated that. I hated those days when that happened. And, maybe if I kind of had a heads up that that's what it was going to be, I would try to find somebody to spend some time with, and that would repair the problem. But let's just face it, none of us like being alone. Now, I don't think this is exactly always a very religious topic, maybe not something that we spend a lot of time talking about in the church building. But I do believe there were several people in the Bible that had experienced being alone. And they talked about that, and God talked to them about being alone. And so ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to get to Elijah. But let me first start here with Paul. Here in Romans 11, Paul is feeling alone. And the reason why is because back in chapter 9 and chapter 10, he had expressed his heartache for his own countrymen not becoming the people they were supposed to be. And he sometimes, I think, felt like the only Jew that cared about the gospel and cared about Christianity. Chapter 9 and chapter 10, he had just expressed that it was part of God's plan from the beginning for the Jews to rebel against the gospel and reject the gospel, and the gospel will be given to the Gentiles. And then the Jews even becoming the number one persecutors of the Christians there in the first century. And that gave him a lot of heartache because that was his people. He was a Jew. And so he kind of encourages himself with what he says here in Romans 11 about that thought about being alone and being the only Jew that seems to care. He says this, look at verse 1. It says, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I am alone and left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed down the knee to Baal. Even so then, at the present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. What Paul is speaking about specifically is the loneliness we feel as Christians, that we know that this is not a big road that a lot of people travel down, and a lot of times being a Christian is lonely, especially when you're a Jewish Christian in the first century. But what does Paul find hope and solace in? He has hope and solace in what God told Elijah hundreds and hundreds of years ago, which was there's still 7,000 out there that still obey God. There's still 7,000 Jews out there somewhere that still obey and believe in God and are going to obey the gospel. And Paul took a lot of hope in that statement. I think what's interesting for us, we think back to Paul as being sometimes a really tough person, someone that was really hard about the gospel and the truth of the gospel. But the more we learn about Paul, our opinion of him kind of evolves, And we kind of learned, actually, Paul was very hard about some things, but down in his hearts and hearts, Paul was kind of a softie. And Paul was a very emotional being, and he got very upset when it came to relationships with brethren. He did get lonely at times. He did lean on other people. Well, that attitude that we have about Paul, probably Paul had also about Elijah. It was probably someone that he looked up to and he drew strength from. Probably felt the same way, that Elijah was a very tough person and he took on a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and he dealt with it. But at the same time, Elijah was a softie. He had a soft heart for people that wanted him and needed him, and he too experienced loneliness. And so what I'd like to do is, instead of staying here in Romans 11, is to turn to 1 Kings 18 and 19 and look to Elijah for strength for this particular issue. And that's what we'll be doing from here on out. We're going to look at Elijah's story, especially the time when he was at his loneliness. Before we kind of evaluate 1 Kings 18, and then we're going to read 1 Kings 19, let me make a point clear, and I think we'd all agree with this point, is that loneliness is an essential problem. Now I know what I want to say. Companionship is an essential need for a human. Humans need companions like they need food and water. And I really can pull this from other things, but let me pull it from a TV show. Damon got me hooked on a TV show called Alone, the very thing that this sermon's titled. And the whole concept, and maybe you've seen it, is they get several men and women and they just go drop them off in the woods somewhere. And they just say, survive, here's a camera. And then they come and they check them weekly and make sure they have enough weight and they've eaten enough food. And sometimes they pull them if they're underweight. And usually every season of that show goes the same way. Usually the first day, like half of them go home because they're not very smart. And they injure themselves, or they have no idea what they're doing. They set their house on fire. It's something like that, and they all get pulled. The next half of the season is the second group of people that leave because they can't eat. They just simply can't get enough food to survive, and they get pulled and tapped out, and they lose. But the last part of every season is the same type of group of people that are very smart. They can handle themselves in the woods. They have plenty of food, but they all are having to battle the same thing, loneliness. And they're alone. And they've been alone for sometimes months. And most of them at the end, the winner is the person who can handle the loneliness. And so when I think about that, I think about that thought. Food and water are essential for life here on this earth. And you can go a longer time without this. But this too is an essential thing for life here on earth. It's companionship. You've got to have somebody to talk to. You got to have somebody to talk to you. And that's essential for life here on this earth. Elijah is experiencing this here in this story. We're going to look at 1 Kings 18, but I'm only going to read one verse out of it. I'd really like to summarize it instead. In 1 Kings 17, we meet Ahab and Jezebel. And they're the king and queen of Samaria, the northern, kingdom of Israel. And Ahab and Jezebel are not good people, are they? Ahab has made a lot of bad decisions. One of them is marrying this foreign woman, Jezebel, who has brought in Baal worship into the nation. There's another thing that Jezebel's doing. Jezebel is not only bringing Baal worship into this nation, but she's also executing God's prophets. She very much is trying to replace everything that Jehovah has set up and replace it with Baal and Baal's prophets. And this has been going on. Because this has been going on, God sends a drought for 3.5 years to try to wake up the people. That, y'all are quickly trying to pull me out of this nation. You need to wake up and realize who really is king of this nation. So he sends this drought for 3.5 years. We meet Elijah because Elijah is sent to go deliver the news. The 3.5 years is going to begin. God is sending a drought because of the wickedness done here. In 1 Kings 18, we see that after that years are up, Elijah returns and he calls the people to choose between God and Baal. And this is what begins that famous story we know about with the competition between him and the Baal prophets. Here's a verse that I overlook too many times. Before that competition happens, look what happens in verse 20 of 1 Kings 18. It says, so Ahab sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. It's not just Ahab there. It's not just Baal's prophets there. It's not just Elijah there. It says all the children of Israel came to Mount Carmel. Now that all the children of Israel are here at Mount Carmel, look what happens in verse 21. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people answered him, not a word. Did you catch that there at the end? I think often I've gone past that and I've forgotten that. That Elijah has this moment where he sees all the people there. And these aren't strangers. These are his brethren. These are supposed to be God's people. And he gets up before him and he's going to have a Joshua moment. He gets up and he says, choose this day whom you shall serve. Whether it be God, follow him, or whether it be Baal, follow him. And what is Elijah expecting? He's expecting we're going to follow God. But what does the verse say happens? But the people answered him not a word. That would be going into a church building and saying, Jesus is the Son of God, amen? And people start looking at you going, well, if something like that happened to us, we would be shocked. We would be appalled. I mean, this should be the place where we do believe Jesus is the Son of God, and you're not even going to answer me? That broke Elijah. And because that broke him is why the next part happens, which is the competition that we remember. Elijah challenges the Baal prophets to a contest, doesn't he? And the contest is, well, let's see whose God brings fire down first. We know the end of the story. God basically explodes his altar, and the Baal altar, just nothing happens at all. And so these 400 plus prophets try to flee and escape, but Elijah gets the people to round them up, and Elijah kills all of Baal's prophets there down by the river underneath Mount Carmel. So things are looking good, things are looking better, but lo and behold, what happens? Jezebel finds out, and she says, I'm going to kill Elijah. And when Elijah hears this, he breaks. And he decides, I'm going to have to run away. That begins here in verse 4 of 1 Kings 19, and we're going to read this whole thing to verse 18. 1 Kings 19, let's starting here in verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father's. Then he lay and slept under a broom tree. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked of coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went into strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. Before we go any further, what's Horeb, the mountain of God? Well, Horeb is the lower part of Palestine. He goes to the mountain of God. What would that be? Well, the only other mountain God I know down there is Mount Sinai. So I believe here he goes to Mount Sinai. Verse 9, and there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Then he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke into rocks, then to pieces before the Lord, and the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. So it was when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because of the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Then the Lord said to him, go, return your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. And you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nishma, as king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel Melech, you shall anoint as the prophet in your place. It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth who has not kissed him. And there's our Romans 11 passage. And what we see as we kept on reading is Elijah went out and he did what God commanded him to do. Well, let's break this down again, and let's take what we're supposed to take out of 1 Kings 19 and 18. What we see here at the beginning is when he feels at his lowest point, he runs. And when he runs, he takes a nap and he wakes up to some food. And you've maybe heard people say this when they teach this, is that a lot of times in our most stressful situations, there's only really two things we need. We need a snack and a nap. I've heard people teach that. And you know what? I don't necessarily disagree with it. Sometimes in a stressful situation, that is what you need, is a snack and a nap. But what we see here especially is that God provides for Elijah food. By the way, he's been providing him food for 3.5 years. Has God abandoned Elijah in his weakest moment? Has God said, well, Elijah, you cowered out, I'm gone? Did God just give up on Elijah when he had a weak moment? No, God stayed with him, didn't he? And he took care of him, provided for him in his weakest moment. That's the type of God that we serve. Elijah flees to Mount Sinai. And basically, if you think about this, he was up in Mount Carmel in Samaria. And then he flees all the way down to Mount Sinai. That would be like being in Huntsville and running all the way down to Mobile to hide. He travels a great distance to really get away from Jezebel. That's how scared he is. And as he's in the cave, God passes by the mountain and speaks to Elijah, doesn't he? And sometimes we get confused at this part, and I understand why. You see here in verse 11 that God comes and he passes by the mountain. And as he passes by the mountain, the first thing he does is he sends this great and mighty wind, and it tears up the mountain. It blows it up, basically. But it says that God wasn't in the wind. And then there's an earthquake in Mount Sinai. But Elijah knows that God's not in the earthquake. And then a fire, and he says, but God's not in the fire. But then he hears a small, quiet voice. And that's when he begins to speak to God. There's a thought here that God wasn't in the earthquake. He wasn't in the fire. He wasn't in the wind. God was in the small little voice. And there's supposed to be a message there. That message is better understood if we had read chapter 18. Because what had just happened in chapter 18? God sent a fireball down from heaven and exploded this altar. It was an incredible event. And what do you think we would have expected if God had done something like that in front of all the people of Israel? Well, we would have expected that everyone would have immediately been converted to God. Like, of course, everyone would be converted to God. He just blew something up. We're all going to obey him now. But was that the case? Elijah's fear makes me believe that that was not the case, that everybody was automatically converted to God. Does God convert people by explosions? Does God convert people because of earthquakes? Does God convert people through him destroying things? How does God convert people? He converts people by his voice, his word. And I think that's probably the message to Elijah here. Elijah, I don't convert people through explosions. I convert people through my word. And I think Elijah saw this here. Here, God reminds Elijah who he is. And then we're given the instructions. And the instruction is to go anoint the king of Syria, go anoint Jehu, go get Elisha to come and be your servant, and one day replace you. And so there's commands given at the end, and that's the end of the story. And there's some hope given at the end. Nolan Baker gave me an outline for this. But he said, Andrew, the way you should outline this whole story is that Elijah had a letdown. And so there was a showdown. And then Elijah had a breakdown on the mountain. And then God gave him the rundown here at Mount Sinai. And that should be your 4 points of your sermon. And I thought that was too good to share, not to share. Some of y'all, that's the only thing you're going to remember out of the sermon. And I guess it's not the worst thing you could remember of this sermon. What I like to do for the rest of the time that we've got is use those 4 commands or the 4 things we see God does for Elijah to combat the feelings that he's feeling. And I think there's something great to glean out of that. Certainly the Apostle Paul gleaned something out of this message in 1 Kings 19. These are the four things that God commands to Elijah to combat what he's feeling. The first one is God reminds Elijah who he is. That's the first thing that I see. And that was that, hey, look, I'm God. I can explode things. I can tear down mountains with my voice, but I am my word. And that's what's important. He reminded Elijah who he is. When you see your God explode an altar, and when you see your God explode a mountain, are you still worried about Jezebel? You shouldn't be, right? And I think there's a message there, right? But as well, you have to understand that God functions the way that God wants to function. We might want to go out there and overpower people with God, but that's not the way God works. God converts people by reason and by his voice and by his gospel. That's the way that God operates. I think if we're combating loneliness, one of the first things we need to do is we need to remind ourselves who our God is. That's almost a good place to start for any problem. Where would we go to remind ourselves who God is? There's probably lots of good answers. If you didn't think of an answer that was this or something in here, your answer was wrong. But if you thought about something in here, your answer was right. Where do we go to remind ourselves who God is? It's Genesis, and it's the Revelation. One book that I thought of immediately was the Psalms. The Psalms remind us who God is. Let me take you to Psalm 46. I looked at the material the large auditorium was doing to make sure I wasn't stepping on somebody else's psalm, and I'm not. No one's doing Psalms 46 this go around. Psalms 46, Corbin read for the first half of us, and we get that great line from here, be still and know that I am God. The be still, I know that I am God, I want you to look at that passage in the context. He's not talking to you and me when he says, be still and know that I am God. In Psalm 46, we have the part that Corbin read from 1 through 7, that God can move mountains, God can stop nations. We get to verse 8, says, come and behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth, who makes wars cease to the end of the earth, who breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Psalm 46 is all about war. And there's wars waging around the psalmist. But what stops the wars? How do wars cease there in verse 9? Well, all he's got to do is say something. And it's verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. And then the wars cease and God's exalted. What I think the thought is here is very similar to Jesus looking at the winds and the waves and saying, peace, be still. And then there was peace and things were still. But God does this here to a war. He says, peace, be still, and they're still. It does take a lot of power to destroy something, but I think it takes even more power to stop a destructive force. And that's who God is. He doesn't just have the power to destroy something. He also has the power to stop a destructive force. And that's who God is. He says it, and it just happens. If we can continually to remind us of that, are we going to run from our Jezebels? We might have some moments of weakness. But I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be running from our Jezebels. We're not going to be running from our Ahabs because we know who God is and we know that he can tell our enemies to be still. And they're going to do it if he so commands it, right? Here's the second thing that God does for Elijah. He gives him a task, doesn't he? Maybe you're back there in verse 15 and verse 16. You see what that task is. I need you to go to Syria. I need you to anoint this king. I need you to go get Jehu. I need you to go get Elisha. And it says that Elijah immediately went and did those things. Something that combated Elijah's emotions here was he just needed a job. He needed something to do. And as soon as he's given something to do, there's a reason why Elijah just goes and does those things. That's the type of person he is, but it also combats his problems of his loneliness and his worries about what the future holds for Israel. Many of y'all have babysat before. It's one of my least favorite activities. My nephew comes over. Often my nephew will say, at some point, get homesick. And he says, call my mom, I want to go home. Well, I mean, like, I know I'm not allowed to call the mom and just say, hey, come get him, unless there's a real bad emergency. So usually what do you do in that situation? Well, I usually do the same thing. I say, hey, well, I need you to do something with me. And after that, we'll call your mom and you can go home. What usually happens? Well, we do the task, right? We play the video game. We finish Star Wars. That's something we're still trying to do. We do those sort of things. And by the time that's over, either he's asleep or he doesn't want to go home anymore. And I think we use that on little children a lot. We say, okay, well, you can go home. But first I need you to do this job for me. And then after you do that job, you can go home. Loneliness happens a lot of times when we're just not busy. And we don't have anything to do. And I think there's a message right there in that God gives Elijah a task. Here's something productive you need to do. We have to find things productive to not be lonely, especially when we're combating that. And that might be very hard to do sometimes, but I think ultimately we probably can find something to do productive every day. Now, I'm going to give some spiritual things in just a second, but let me list off some physical things to kind of get your ideas about that. You can clean up your house. Somebody in this room would really like me to do that. Cleaning up. That right there would give you a task, something productive to do, and that would be helpful. You can come up here and clean up the building if you want to. There's some things in corners downstairs that need to, where did this junk come from? I'm finding it all the time. There's things you could be doing to be productive and to help. And you could just talk to somebody about that. You could find something to do if you're looking for something to do, right? You can clean up your yard. There's things you can do to stay busy and productive. Now, I'll tell you what has never helped me. It's TV and the internet. I have never watched TV when I was bored and lonely or got on the internet when I was bored and lonely and something productive happened. I usually felt worse after because just bringing in constant entertainment, that's not what satisfies that itch that God gave us to be productive and to accomplish things in this life. Now, let me give you the best things I think that are good tasks that stop the emotions that Elijah's happened. There's spiritual productive things we can be doing. And that would be things I used to do it, I still do it. It's just to get a book out of the Old Testament, get a book out of the New Testament and say, hey, today I'm going to read a lot of this, and I'm going to outline it in this notebook. And right there, that was something productive that happened, and I accomplished the task, and I felt better after the end of it. It gave me something to do. A lot of y'all have come to our Bible studies we have here weekly through the building just because you don't have anything better to do. And you're bored and you're looking for something to do, so you come to the Bible study. That's wonderful. More power to you. I don't know how many good Bible students came from people that were simply just looking for something to do. And so they decided to be a part of a Bible study. And they learned something while they were there, and they became very good Bible students just because they were looking for something to do. And this year, we've really utilized a large auditorium. We've stayed out here spread out, but we've always had to have something going on here. That's something you can be a part of. And it will kind of satisfy that itch to accomplish a task. There's going to be plenty of things to do and to be active. But when you're sitting on the couch all day, and I understand that there's a situation where you're sick and you're sitting on the couch all day. I'm not talking about that situation. But when you're in a normal situation and you're sitting on the couch all day, and then you complain to God in your prayers that you're lonely, what's God going to tell you? Maybe you need to be doing something productive. And that would probably solve the problem. Certainly that's what he told Elijah. Let's move to our third one. God instructs Elijah to find companions. And that's when, especially when we meet Jehu and we meet Hazel, but really who we meet is Elisha. And Elisha here becomes the person we get introduced to the very first time. And Elisha becomes the companion of Elijah till the very end, and even, breaks down in tears when Elijah leaves. This becomes his closest companion because of being told to go get him here. And you see in verse 19 that he goes and he finds Elisha, and that Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him, and he left the oxen and he ran after Elijah, and he said, let me kiss my mother and father before I leave. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? In verse 21, then Elisha turned back from him, and he took a yoke of the oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh using the ox equipment and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and followed Elijah and became his servant. And that becomes one of these most powerful relationships in Kings as we go through. But Elijah had to go get him. Can you imagine just for a second in a fake world where God says, go get these companions, and Elijah says no? Would that have helped? That wouldn't have helped the situation at all. There is a need. Going back to what we said at the very beginning, there is a need, a human need, and I'll even say a Christian need for companionship. To have brothers and sisters, to have fellow men, to have some type of companionship. And I know that may look differently this year than it's looked like in the past. But there's still a possibility in a way to have companionship right now. And I know it's kind of silly. What's the cure for loneliness? Well, it's not being lonely. It's having somebody. And that's what Elijah was given here. He was given somebody. Can you think about people in the Bible, godly people, that relied on their companions? Daniel? Did he not rely on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Elijah, did he not rely on Elisha? Did Paul not rely on Luke and Aristarchus? Did not Jesus rely on Peter and James and John? Or what about the 4 women that were with Jesus till the very end? Did those godly people not rely on others? When I think and read about all those people that had close companions that they worked with and that they labored with, and they held them accountable, and then on the other hand, you'll meet Christians that'll say things like, I don't need nobody. Well, Jesus needed somebody. Paul needed somebody. Daniel needed somebody, but you don't need nobody? That doesn't make any sense, does it? It doesn't make any sense at all. When you make people that refuse to be part of congregations because they don't want to get close to anybody, do you think Daniel and Paul and Jesus had attitudes like that? I don't really want to, identify with this group because I just don't want to get close to y'all. I don't want y'all knowing what I'm doing. I want y'all out of my business. How can someone be successful in this life and have that kind of attitude? In the light of this context, it doesn't make any sense. And I think that's something important that we need to make. Now, one thing I'd like to notice here before we leave is that Elijah had to do something to get those companions. He had to leave Mount Sinai. He had to leave fear. And he had to put himself out there and go find Elisha, someone he had probably never met. And he had to go tell him what God told him to do. And that took some courage. Elijah had to put himself out there to find a companion. And sadly, I think maybe because of our own weaknesses and our own fears, we sit around and we twiddle our thumbs and we wait for a companion to come and find us. And that's just not the way it works. If you want a friend, you're going to have to go out of yourselves and go find a friend. You might have to go out and make a friend. And that companionship really satisfies that need to handle our loneliness. And I think that's what God's pulling out of here, that he goes and instructs Elijah to go find his companions. Before we leave and move to our last point, let me go quickly in another box. It's strange in preaching that sometimes you end up in a situation where preachers can't help you at all. And maybe that's a situation where someone comes to you from a congregation and just says, I'm incredibly lonely. I feel like I don't have any friends. What do I need to do? As a preacher, you want to have a spiritual answer, a Bible answer. And I think from today, we've kind of established there are some passages we can look at and talk about that thing. But sometimes the solution isn't spiritual as much as it's, kind of carnal, that you're going to have to put yourself out there. You're going to have to go talk to people. You're going to have to, really put some more effort in this. Maybe you need to stop doing this. And you end up having those conversations with people. And I'm fine to have those conversations with people. I know Jason's fine to have those conversations. We like it when people come and ask us questions. But, some of them, this just isn't this perfect Bible answer. Sometimes people have come to me and they say, I'm sorry, I just don't feel like I fit in with anyone. I'm lonely. And I don't fit in with anybody. Nobody has me over. Nobody calls me. Nobody wants to spend any time with me. And a lot of those people, there's just simple things that needs to be fixed, and that's fine. But there's also a group of those people they'll come and tell me those things, and I know full well why they don't have any companions. It's because they're miserable people. Thank you. The God doesn't like spending his time with complainers, right? We don't like spending time with complainers either. Going back to our individuals, do you think there was a reason why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel liked to spend time together? You think maybe it was because they were hopeful and they were righteous and they loved God and they knew each other loved God, and that's why they liked spending time together? Because Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they could have spent a lot of times complaining about their situation. But when I read them, I don't see that. Why do you think Luke and Aristarchus and Paul like to spend time together? You think it's because they were hopeful? And even though they were living under the worst persecution the church has ever seen, they were hopeful about their situations. They loved God. They know each other loved God. And there was a lot of great things to talk about there. Why do you think Peter, James, and John like to spend time with Jesus? Was Jesus a complainer? Or was Jesus hopeful? One of the best ways to make God-fearing companions is to be hopeful about our situation before God. To love God brings other people that love God. And I think Elijah found companions like that, especially in Elisha. And I think we can too. Here's the fourth thing God told him. God tells Elijah that there are still 7,000 that refuse to worship Baal. There's something hopeful to be taken from that. And I believe that if Paul can look at Elijah's story and he can take hope from Elijah's story that there's still people out there that still love God, I'm not all by myself, then we can go back to Elijah and Paul's story and take the same thing for us. That even if we were in a building worshiping with just 2 people, we could take hope in the thought that there's still people out there somewhere that love God and care about him just as much as we do. To kind of wrap things up, let me ask a question. Is heaven going to be a crowded place? Is there going to be a lot of people in heaven? Some of your minds went back to what Jesus said about the wide gate and the small gate. You maybe have answered no, there's not going to be a lot of people in heaven. But Jesus isn't answering that question there. He's talking about the majority and the minority of all the people ever made. Now, if we had that question, yeah, there is a small gate that's on its way to heaven. But I asked the question, is there going to be a lot of people in heaven? Seth read the passage for us this morning. Look at Hebrews 2, starting in verse 9, and the answer is in verse 10. Is there going to be a lot of people in heaven? Hebrews 2:9 says, but we see Jesus, who is made a little lower than the angels, for the suffering of death crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory. I can stop right there because that's our answer. How many sons have been brought to glory? There's been many sons been brought to glory. Is there going to be a lot of people in heaven? There is going to be a lot of people in heaven. And that's because there's still 7,000 that have not bowed down to Baal. There's a lot of companions, and there's a lot of companions to be offered in the church. How many companions are going to be offered there to be around with God in the throne room in his glory? As a way of invitation, thank you for your close attention. This world is not a nice place. There's going to be nice things about it and things we can be happy about. But ultimately, your life here on this earth, there's going to be a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of sorrows. There's going to be a lot of loneliness. There's going to be a lot of heartache. But frankly, I'd rather experience all those things as a Christian with a hope for a better future than experience all those same things and not be a Christian with no hope for the future. And it's kind of a logical thing. If this world's going to be so bad, I might as well, but the next one be better. That's why Jesus has been the captain of our salvation. That's why he's trying to bring many sons to glory. If you're one of those sons or daughters that want Jesus to bring to glory, please let us assist you tonight if you'll come forward as we stand and sing.